Now, a related issue, I suppose, would be uh, how archaeology and archaeologists um, are comprised in terms of the demographics of people who are attracted to doing archaeology, and the people who then go on to live the life of an archaeologist. And what we're doing in this section is lumping together a few different articles which talk about the quality of life of archaeologists. The first one was brought to
There
my
is one.
um, quality. Quality doesn't have to be good or bad. It's a range of things. But nonetheless, the first article came to my attention was why archaeology may need to change. This is written by Heather Wood, lifestyle editor for the Royal Gazette, and she was interviewing Catherine Draycott, or Kathy Draycott, someone who I have had the pleasure of filming, but I haven't yet interviewed her. I'd like to
Um,
interview her at some point. A Bermudian archaeologist, yeah,
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 Bermudan.
yeah,
Yes.
archaeologist, um, where the interview starts out very specifically asking the question, why is archaeology so white? Now, initially, I have an instinct to slightly recoil from that question, in so much as I then become very aware that I am firmly in a certain demographic of archaeologists. I am a white male.
Likewise.
I have a great big beard, and I'm slightly left-leaning um, idealist in some respects. But I think it's important to acknowledge that this interview is very interesting because she examines some elements of questions as to how and why people get involved in archaeology. Actually, I think a very sensible way. So one of the questions is, why do you think that archaeology draws so few people of colour? And Kathy's answer is, although archaeology is conducted worldwide and involves a great breadth of materials and periods, archaeology departments and units tend to have very low numbers of black and ethnic minority members. Of course, Japanese, Indian, Turkish, and African university departments, for example, are far less dominated by European people. But this does not mitigate disparities in the makeup and balance of the discipline overall, and especially in the low numbers of black practitioners in the field in countries dominating it, Europe, the UK, and the USA. One could argue that this disparity is a simple reflection of social makeup. There are a minority of BME people working in and studying archaeology because BME people are, by definition, in the minority. Except that this is not always true, she goes on to say. Case in point, Bermuda. And although proper survey is necessary to establish secure numbers, proportions of representation and participation seem quite out of kilter with actual social demographics. She goes on. Partly, one could look at historical and current economic factors that affect low recruitment to degrees not considered to lead to secure and high earning future employment in general. But this cannot entirely explain it, since other subjects such as history and literature are not. That are also not directly employment orientated are not affected in quite the same extent. Archaeology does offer employment prospects in an expanding field, and anecdotal evidence suggests that archaeology is considered a niche area. And the main factor, though, is probably identity. It is easy to see why studying the past is not appealing if you feel your ancestry is not only unrepresented, but also unwelcome. There are so few people, or there are so far few people, rather, uh, but important BME leaders in archaeology, and the provision of topics in which BME communities might feel greater investment, such as African or New World/African diaspora archaeology, runs into a problem that universities, at least in the UK, may be unwilling to invest in areas that have not formed of their a part of their particular curricula before. If there is no ready-made or clearly identifiable market for it, and increasingly, actually, market is a key aspect of education, certainly in the UK, higher education, then
I
it's
had
unlikely
I
to.
don't know if you heard the Today program this morning as we're recording. We had the senior manager from Liverpool University um, audibly getting uncomfortable. It was a radio program, audibly getting uncomfortable when she was being questioned about the university's campus in China
Hmm.
and its effect on academic freedom and what they were and weren't allowed to discuss.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Yeah, again, there's a academic cultural component as well there.
Mm.
Um, uh, and she goes on to talk about the idea that there's an unintentional partitioning of Black past and therefore Black archaeology and also uh, other other archaeologies. And I suppose I'll end just by saying I don't want to read the whole interview, obviously, but she
Mm.
says here that any academic discipline needs to grow in order to stay healthy. This goes beyond simply bringing in new topics of study because uh, because including people from differing social backgrounds brings in also new perspectives on existing topics of study. Secondly, this issue is important for the health of society. Ideas of the past are constantly used to support present day policies, particularly in the world of politics, and ethnic and national identities, therefore, and nation states, territorial claims, and power and civic rights are touched on by these ideas. So it's interesting that this interview came to my attention, but also actually in conjunction with a an article um, written in the Catholic Herald. Now, bear with
Yes.
me, just bear with me. I don't often read the Catholic
No, no.
Herald, but it came to my attention. Um, Written by Eduardo Albert and Paul Gething, examining what it's like to be an archaeologist. And the headline is Bad Backs, Alcoholism, and Paranoia. Archaeology isn't for the faint-hearted. And in this, for example, we start out with a case study of Brian Hope Taylor, an archaeologist who I'm quite familiar with, who did lots of
Me
work in the
too. In
Northeast.
fact, what his series about the Dark Ages on television in the late
Mm,
1960s, I think it was one of the things that turned me onto archaeology.
yeah,
Excavator of the palace complex at Yevering.
yeah. Well, exactly. Yes, yeah. And he's described here, briefly, I'll just add here, as a protective paranoid archaeologist who went from lecturing at Cambridge and becoming a popular television personality, as you say, to being undone by drink, abandoning his life's work, and hiding his findings from other archaeologists in order to avoid his exaggerations being exposed. Oh, okay, that's a bit harsh. Alcohol, the authors note forlornly, plays a large part in archaeology. And uh, and finally, as well, we also have this idea of therefore archaeologists being essentially uh, having trouble in terms of recruitment from different social groups to having a quality of life issue. We also have the irony in the third article that we're highlighting here that archaeology for other people is actually a route through which lots of money can be made through illicit trade and, for example, money laundering, so on and so forth. So for people like Brian Hope Taylor and for people who are looking at the prospect of an archaeological career, there are some ironies inherent in handling cultural treasures and not necessarily being treasured yourself
Mm.
as an archaeologist. Now, I've had to work quite hard to stitch all this together, but I think there's something there. I think in so much as examining, well, frankly, why should anyone be an archaeologist, and who should those people be? Yes, I mean, and who should we be looking to reach out to as archaeologists?
It's that has to be a question we've all asked ourselves at some point. I
Mm,
mean, I always joke with people when people ask me what I do. I always say that I'd swap one insecure, badly paid profession, which was working in theatre and
mm,
theatre arts,
mm,
in the performing arts, for another one, which is working in archaeology. Um, you know, and but also there are things that are very much in common in those two professions. One is team working,
mhm,
and I really enjoy team working, and um, other people sharing skills to a common end,
mhm, mhm.
and we all with different skills that we can work with together to create something greater than the sum of the parts.
Mm,
Um, and also the use of imagination and storytelling. Although again, there are perhaps academic and scientific colleagues who say that storytelling doesn't enter into it and shouldn't enter into it. And also entertainment. Actually,
mm,
Brian Hope Taylor made his name on television as a public figure.
mhm, mhm,
Before that, there was Sir Mortimer Wheeler and Professor Glyn Daniel.
mhm,
So they were entertainers as much as anything else. Other people had their levels of archaeological knowledge, but they didn't have the ability to project through a camera.
no, no,
And so um, it's. I think we're right to look at these as sort of complex issues, and I fall back, as I say, having worked previously in the performing arts, and I did ask our head of department at my university drama department once, had they, when I was coming to the end of my time as a student there at Bristol,
Hmm.
I said, and this is somebody who'd been heavily involved in recruiting to the department, and interviewing students every year and so on, and watching, at that point, about 25 years worth of undergrads come through.
Mm.
And he said that, I said, what was there anything that we all had in common? Because we seemed like quite a disparate group in terms of background and, uh, but social background, where we came from in the country and so on. It was roughly 50-50 men, women, and there weren't any BAME students at the time.
Mm.
Um, and this is the early 1980s. And he said, the only thing you've got in common is that you're all people who wouldn't be happy doing anything else.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it is that idea that maybe professions like the arts, like archaeology in its traditional form, are vocational. You don't go into them for the money. You
Mm.
go into them because you think they're important. You think you can bring something to the party,
Mm.
and there's something that fulfill you as a person, and that, I think, is when if you look at some of the responses to some of the Me Too art, uh, issues that have been raised recently, um, there are people saying, how's this happened? We should be better than that.
Mm.
You know, we're meant we're one of the humanities, for goodness sake. We're not meant to. We're meant to understand and share, and we're not meant to bully and impose power structures.
Yeah, but that I'm definitely being strongly influenced by my amazing wife when I just go, yeah, but only really certain people could say that, you
Yeah,
know,
exactly.
like
No,
I s-
I'm not saying, I'm not saying I agree with that position. I'm just making the observation.
yeah.
And
And
um,
let me just clarify for people at home,
go
people listening, in so much as uh, and tell you what, I'll stick within the remit that I can speak on from my lived experience. For example, going to a very posh university, those people, and actually even today, I've noticed that my old university's newspaper is saying, "Goodness me, the Labour Party wants to close down private schools. However, will we survive?" Completely dismissing the lived experience of people who are from working class backgrounds, or maybe the first generation to go to a university. Uh, Never mind the experience, therefore, if we tag on to that, for example, some of the things that my wife's talked about in terms of her lived experience as a woman who is intelligent, as a woman who did not feel that she should subscribe to some of the cultural movements in Northern Ireland, the sectarian element in Northern Ireland growing up. Never mind tagging on to that the lived experience of people who happen to have a different skin color, or or whose parents perhaps want them to achieve in ways that are secure in order to secure their life way and their status as newly, say, may perhaps moved into a country or into a community. There are all sorts of pressures on people, especially when it comes to a subject in the humanities, to, I suppose, on the one hand, do well, but also, as you say, balance it with this desire to also have a fulfilling life, and the extent to which you can indulge the desire to have a fulfilling life is
mm,
is it's hard it's not something that we should take for granted, in so much as I just barely tick the box where I can indulge in archaeology. I think, had I been a couple of years older, I would have had to go into local council work or some other job. If so, I mean, so breaking through, I suppose in my specific case, a class ceiling in archaeology. I'm
mm,
not saying that I'm a pioneer, but I'm part of a generation of pioneers over the past,
yeah.
in terms of like a 10, 15-year window. Um, is just it just gives me I can't help but think that, and I'm sure you've experienced similar things as well, which is you've probably come up against some very weird attitudes from some older archaeologists about, well, for example, I once heard, I won't say who, but I once heard someone say that basically archaeology should simply be an honourable profession where people do it as a hobby. I've heard people say that it shouldn't even be a profession in that sense. Um, so I know that's been a slightly round the houses way of describing it, but I suppose what I'm saying is it's hard to so I can understand why someone might say, "Oh, we should be better than this in humanities," but I think the
Mm.
person saying that hasn't lived, certainly hasn't lived, for example, my life, and definitely hasn't lived my wife's life, and definitely hasn't lived, a friend who it maybe has an Indian parent's life, this kind of thing.
Yeah,
If that makes sense.
it does, and not just in archaeology, but across the board in many professions. We're seeing it in the media, we're seeing it in museums and management and so on. The phrase is pale, male, and stale.
Mm,
It's that too many people in positions of authority appear to conform to those particular attributes.
mm,
And it's an allegation, and
mm,
there are many. Obviously, there are many. I would argue uh, many progressive white males in
mm,
various professions. At the same time, yes, obviously, of course, there are people whose influence and opinions and attitudes are malign and counterproductive. And
well,
you
and
know, and
yet,
it, go on.
sorry, and yet, we there's a reason that I set up, for example, Archaeosoup the way I did, to have a
Mm,
background apart from the Welsh flag here, obviously today, things like books and these
yeah,
appeals to authority that people can relate to
yeah,
from their experience in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, growing up seeing a
mm,
certain type of man talking with authority about the past. It's funny how even though I don't directly relate to those people in terms of lived experience, we're still using that iconography to reassure people that we know what we're talking about. And that's before we even get on
yeah,
to the other issues that we highlight with these articles in terms of quality of life. The fact that actually it is by no means a well-paid profession, and it is a profession that can lead to high rates of mental health problems,
absolutely.
and you are often on the edge of observing very lucrative darker sides of archaeology as well. Yeah, these issues I think are interconnected, um, and yet we still, for example, you do it as well. We framed you or in these discussions with your bookcase behind you and these because
Yeah.
it helps you come across as someone who knows what they're talking about. It reassures people that oh, well, actually, I have done some reading. It's fine. You can listen to me. It's interesting, I think, the relationship we have with
Except
these
also, yeah, but
authority
except
structures.
also, it's a film set. It's about appearance.
Yeah. Mm,
You have, the other, the really malign side of it that we're linking this discussion to are the highly professional people, often white men, it has to be said,
mm,
who are involved in at, at best, the turning a blind eye to illicit antiquities going into auction houses and so on, to the people who are actively involved in things like money laundering
mm,
through high-end cultural artifacts, paintings, objects.
mm,
You know,
mm,
I mean, it's like I keep on going back to the case of Sekem from Northampton Museum, but when that was sold at Christie's, that statue was sold at Christie's. They did a brilliant job. Their academic staff, their experts, did a brilliant job in photographing, presenting, and reporting in the catalogue on the history of that artifact.
So, bringing this back to the Kathy Draycott interview, I
Mm,
suppose I would initially say that I'm encouraged that the question is why does archaeology need to change, not does archaeology need to change. This
mm,
idea of an imperfect a status is one that we need to acknowledge for various reasons. But also, I suppose I would add to that in my own small way by saying that archaeology has demonstrably changed in recent years, relatively recent years, and that direction of change and the rate of change seemingly is only increasing. And we need to make sure that the momentum continues. But so in my small way, the fact that I can have a relatively luxurious career doing educational work and archaeology related activities is luxurious compared to, for example, my dad. My dad's life path could not have afforded him the opportunities and the things that I've been able to do in my life. And I'm really pleased that that rate of change, the direction of change, the mode of change is and has been continuing and spreading in directions that just make archaeology richer and better, I think. Definitely.
I, I think you're right. I mean, all fields have to develop and change because the world changes.
Yeah.
We have different tools to play with
Mm.
than our predecessors had to play with, but we also live in a different cultural world.
Mm.
Um, and we've already had we've had really important projects like the Trailblazers, who've
Mm.
done brilliant work in trying to bring the role of
Mm.
women in archaeology and paleontology back, and put them back into the story where they always belonged, but maybe were sometimes, for whatever reason, written out, or their involvement was hidden behind perhaps more powerful male figures.
Well, a recent example was at Sutton Hoo. I think was it last month or the month before when that was definitely highlighted that women weren't just visiting the site; they were
They
digging
were
on the
working.
site. And
Absolutely,
incidentally,
yeah.
the link of the month this month is the Trailblazers Wikipedia Edit-A-Thon in conjunction with the UCL, where they're going to be literally reinstating women in their proper place as acknowledged as archaeologists and scientists and uh, often pioneers in the field. So again, it can only be good, and I think.
I think we have to accept and acknowledge as
Mhm.
well that, though, that as with um, there weren't overt accusations of racism in that interview,
No.
but certainly there has been, if not, there have probably, almost certainly been, for example, issues around what is sometimes called corporate racism in terms of how valued certain archaeologies are,
Mm,
um,
mm,
and that which. And I think we also have to acknowledge as well that change can come from very negative experiences, as we've seen with the Me Too movement, which is also taking hold in archaeology, sadly.
mm.
As a profession, we're not immune to that, evidence of that kind of behaviour, and hopefully that will change the way the roles of men and women are addressed. So there's more. It is a more level playing field.
And I suppose that's kind of why I've lumped these articles together in this conversation is that this element of, for example, institutional or corporate or however you want to frame it, racism or at best a blind spot for histories of people or individuals who,
Well, I mean, look at the PR catastrophe that the Society of American Archaeology got
yeah,
into, with the Me Too issues earlier on
yeah,
in the autumn.
exactly. So, but so there's that element, but there's also an ongoing day-to-day lived experience of being an archaeologist that we also need to address as well. It's one thing to want more and different types of people to be archaeologists, but I think we should also keep our foot on the pedal when it comes to quality of life,
Yeah,
quality of career path, mental health elements, and also as related to ongoing conversations, for example, linked with things like HS2 in this country,
yeah,
being able to sustain a field of archaeologists or a sector of archaeologists healthily, such that when they're needed, they can be called upon, and we're not having to rush to
yeah.
recruit people as well.
Uh,
There's all
th-
sorts
th-
of elements.
Absolutely. There's 2 points I would make just about the current situation in Britain, though, which make me concerned about that future.
Mm.
And they're both based on news stories from the last couple of days, in fact. Um, Yesterday, and I'm going to mention the B word, Prime Minister Boris
Batman. Oh
Johnson.
no.
No, it's the Joker this month, anyway.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Uh, Yesterday, Prime Minister Boris Johnson put forward his latest proposals to the European Union for an exit deal. Uh, Part of that was an acknowledgement that there was no need to keep level playing field provisions
Mm,
for as will be the case in a customs union and single market. What that means is that the government is prepared to change um, workers' rights and conditions and environmental conditions as laid down in EU law.
mm,
Um, and most people suspect that if that happens, it will be negative. It
yeah,
will be a rowback on existing environmental conditions and workers' rights,
yeah, yeah,
which obviously impacts on things like working time directive in terms of the hours that you can work, an employer can force you to work and things like that.
yeah.
So that's a negative one. And the other one was the story of an Oxford academic who's been recruited but is not allowed to have her children come and live with her because she is not living in the UK with her husband partner, who's a Cameroonian,
Mm,
and their two children are currently with him. Uh, for family stability, they prefer to have the children staying with her, but because they're not living as a family, she's not allowed to have the children with her, which to my mind is just absolutely outrageous. But how does anybody, how do you make a choice between a job at one of the world's most prestigious universities and having your children with you?
mm,
You shouldn't be put in that position.
no, no.
But the British Home Office will put you in that position. Thanks, guys and girls.
Sorry, I should say for people listening, not watching, I laughed there ironically. I despair. I really do despair. All right, I smirked
It is
ironically.
so depressing when you read stories like that.
Yeah. However, and I mean, I don't want to keep on adding on to the addendums to this, but however, what I should say is, therefore, it is incumbent upon us all to try and ensure that what gains have been made are maintained wherever possible, and that
Onwards and upwards.
hopefully, fingers
Yeah.
crossed. Yeah.